In the modern classroom environment, students are surrounded by distractions, external pressures, and things that make them devalue learning. So it truly makes teachers wonder, how can I keep my students engaged? What truly drives a student's success in the classroom? How can I motivate them to be successful and reach their goals? Hi, my name is Shamor, and today I'm going to share 4 effective motivation strategies that are rooted in established educational theories. But most importantly, I will also discuss practical interventions that teachers can use to inspire and support student learning. We want to learn how to take strategies from theory and put them into practice. So, the first strategy is rooted in the expectancy value theory, which was popularized by Jacqueline Eccles and Alan Wigfield in the 1980s. With this theory, it suggests that a student's motivation will be influenced by A, how likely they are to succeed at the task, and B, how valuable the reward for that task is. Now, according to Wigfield, expectancy, or the belief in your own abilities, is defined as the individual's perception of his or her current competence at a given activity. Thus, expectancy is influenced by past experiences and what we call self efficacy. The term self efficacy was coined by Albert Bandera and describes the belief in your own abilities to succeed and accomplish specific tasks. Now, if a student feels like they're unlikely to perform well or succeed, they're going to shy away from that task, and they'll be less motivated to perform well. For example, when I was a kid, I played soccer, and I'll be honest, I sucked. I was horrible. Although it was a brief experience and I was very young, my failure to perform well shook my self efficacy. As I grew older, I shied away from trying to play soccer whatsoever, and I had no motivation to work on or improve my game because I had a low expectancy. But the next part of the formula is defining a task value. Values define why a task is worth pursuing. So you want to answer, what's the benefit? Who are you trying to please? How will it shape your identity or future? What is your why? Like expectancy, values are shaped by a student's prior experiences, beliefs, and individual goals. So there's really 4 types of values. We have attainment values. Those are personal importance of doing tasks or doing well on a task. For example, someone with an attainment value would want to perform well in school because they feel like it's part of who they are as a person. It's tied to their identity. Next, you have intrinsic values. These are enjoyment that a student derives from performing the activity. For example, if someone enjoys playing basketball, it makes them happy, they're probably going to spend more hours a day practicing. Next, we have utility values. That's how well a task relates to current or future career goals. For example, if someone desires to get into a particular college, they're likely going to try and perform better in school so they can reach a 4.0 GPA. That way, they can be accepted by their desired college or university. Then finally, you also have to consider the cost. Cost is basically the time and opportunities that a student has to give up in order to accomplish that task. Maybe they really want to go to a party, but they can't because they have other school assignments that must be done. So now that we have an overview of this theory, what are some motivational strategies that you can implement? Well, the first step is to find strategies that will increase your students' self efficacy. Remember, if a student feels like a task is too hard for them, they're less likely to be interested. Now, this doesn't mean that you have to dumb down your instruction altogether, so to speak, but you want to make sure that your students are set up for success. Ensure that your students have the strategies and scaffolds necessary to succeed at their assigned task. So before giving them some work or an assignment, ask yourself these questions. Do they know how to get started on the problem or task at hand? Can I break this large assignment into smaller, manageable steps so students aren't overwhelmed? Am I giving positive, supportive, and constructive feedback on assignments? Or do I just angrily paint the page with red ink and tell the kids that they did a horrible job? So, next, you want to help students recognize a meaningful way to connect learning to their values. And you also want to make sure that you're honest about the cost. So, here's how you can do that. The first step, connect learning to future goals. If you know that the student wants to be a doctor, explain to them the importance of paying attention in biology class. Then help them see the real world benefits. Now, on a personal note, I hated math because I knew that there was no way I would ever need to know how to find the circumference of a hexagonal prism in my life. But I tended to focus more on math when I realized that the principles were used in things that I cared about, like budgeting, cooking, time management, practical skills that would benefit me in the real world. You can also provide external rewards for your students. At the outset of the assignment, encourage them to select a reward for themselves. Maybe it's a snack, a break, or just an acknowledgement that they're independently accomplishing their goals. The final step is to review the cost. And you want to be honest with your students. Understand that sometimes our students are being asked to sacrifice other assignments, spending time with friends, or doing recreational things that they enjoy. So help them weigh the pros and cons and make good decisions. Help them identify barriers or obstacles that might hold them back, and then give them the support to address those obstacles. Now, I've had experience implementing the EV theory in my professional life, working with a rehab patient I'll address as Miss Jane. Now, I began implementing targeted approaches to improve her self efficacy and thus her expectancy. It started off by setting small goals and celebrating every small win. Over time, these small wins accumulated into bigger victories. For example, one of our goals for Miss Jane was for her to eventually walk for 30 continuous minutes on the treadmill. Now, when she first started in the program, she was not fit enough to sustain that long a duration. If on the initial visit we set a 30-minute timer and she failed, she likely would have been discouraged and less likely to continue with the program. So instead, I set a 10-minute timer. Now, on the first day, although Miss Jane struggled to reach 10 minutes, we celebrated like crazy as soon as she crossed that threshold. Now, you could see in real time her confidence and self belief grow. Now, after a few days of practice, that 10 minutes began to extend to 15, then 20, and then eventually a full 30-minute period on the treadmill. So, by providing Miss Jane an opportunity to be successful, breaking down her task into manageable chunks, I like to call them stepping stones to success, we were able to increase her expectancy and motivation at a large. But more than that, I wanted Miss Jane to connect her rehab program to certain values in her life. So I asked questions to prompt self reflection. I asked, who or what is most important to you? How has your health impacted your ability to connect to those things? How can rehab help you connect to those things? Now, in response, Miss Jane mentioned that being a grandmother was super important to her. So from there, I was able to help her see how that fell into attainment and even utility values. Her identifying what matters to her in life, being a grandmother, and then also recognizing how being healthy, making lifestyle changes, and take rehab seriously can help her do so successfully. Well, that was a vital step in the motivational process. Now, the next central psychological approach is Carol Dweck's goal orientation theory. Now, the GO theory prescribes an individual's motivation as three different factors. The first being mastery or learning goals, suggesting that people engage in a task to learn a new skill and increase their efficacy. Now, this is associated with the most positive outcomes. Now, the second would be performance approach goals. This describes your competitive drive. The fact that people engage in perfecting a task simply so they can perform better than others. Lastly, we have performance avoidance goals. In this category, it suggests people engage in a task so that they can minimize their likeliness of failure. Now, Chapter 5 from Excellence in Teaching, 2009, Volume 9, entitled Fostering a Mastery Goal Orientation in the Classroom, explains this. When students adopt mastery oriented goals, they engage in more effective learning strategies, such as learning from their mistakes, changing strategies that don't work, and seeking help when necessary. They are also more intrinsically motivated, the gold standard of motivation. Performance goals lead to a focus on the outcome, avoiding the appearance of incompetence and being more susceptible to extrinsic sources of motivation. So, what does that mean? How can being mastery oriented help students? Well, students who are mastery oriented focus more on giving effort. They view learning as a necessary and productive process, and they're more likely to persist through challenges and mistakes. Now, on the contrary, students with a performance orientation are motivated by demonstrating their ability compared to others. Students with performance avoidance goals are more likely to give up when work becomes difficult because mistakes may feel like evidence that they lack ability. Students may engage in what's defined as self handicapping. These are deliberate actions and choices that reduce the chances of success. A student may self handicap in a number of ways. They could not work hard, they might even procrastinate about completing an assignment, or set goals that are so unrealistically high that there's no drawback if they don't reach it. So, how do we address this? Well, you want to focus on personal growth more than comparing to peers. Comparing students to one another promotes performance goals. But when you compare students to their own previous performance, that encourages mastery. Now, I remember when I was in school, we would often compete with one another to see who would accumulate the most accelerated reader or AR points. The teacher would even put all of our names on the wall and slide us over each time we got points, as if to simulate an actual race. Now, while it was a good and healthy competition, at the time it did motivate me to read more books. It probably was not the most productive long term strategy. Because as soon as it was clear that I was being significantly outpaced by my peers, well, I just had less of a desire to keep reading, to keep accumulating points at all. So instead of keeping scores with my classmates, like, I want you, Shamor, to have more points than Johnny, the teacher should have set personal goals. Like, I want you, Shamor, to reach 1,500 points this school year. That way, the whole classroom's personal improvement and growth could be celebrated, instead of just one person being celebrated for being the best. This likely would increase motivation and confidence across the board and have more benefits in the long term. But another strategy we can employ is normalizing mistakes and providing positive feedback. We want the focus to shift from being right to getting better. If we do so, the fear of failure will decrease. See, students will no longer avoid trying because they don't want to look dumb. Students will instead show greater effort and persistence when they value the process over the results, especially after setbacks. Now, in this article by Vanderwall, They state that the perception of negative feedback about current performance does not provide much of a morale boost about the prospects for future task performance. So, we want to be more uplifting and positive when correcting students. Help them identify that these are not fundamental flaws, but rather opportunities for growth and improvement. Now, in a real world application, I use this positive feedback approach to help a man named Mr. John train for a marathon. And I use what's called the compliment sandwich approach of feedback, which I admit is kind of cheesy, but it is a great way to ensure that I always acknowledge the positive side of things and appreciated his effort before and after I gave honest and necessary feedbacks on the things that went wrong during his training session. And also, slight tweaks in phrasing were beneficial, or slight tweaks in phrasing, I should say, were beneficial. So instead of telling Mr. John, hey man, that run was way too hard for you, instead I should have said, that run was pretty difficult, but at least we know what we can improve on next time. Or instead of telling Mr. John, you ran a lot slower than you did last week, instead I could say, hey, you did a great job being consistent this week. Next week, we're going to start working more on your speed. So, whenever I change my phrasing to emphasize growth, consistency, and positivity, Mr. John is more likely to adopt a mastery oriented approach to his goals. He's going to strengthen his motivation by focusing on long term improvements instead of always dwelling on the negatives. What's going wrong? So, what's the conclusion? Well, both expectancy value theory and goal orientation theory provide powerful frameworks for understanding student motivation in the classroom. The EV theory emphasizes that students are more motivated when they believe they can succeed and when they see a value in the task. GO theory highlights the importance of fostering mastery focused goals that are centered on growth, effort, and learning rather than performance alone. When these theories are applied intentionally, they help educators create environments where students feel capable, engaged, and invested in their learning. Motivational strategies that are aligned with these theories, such as boosting self efficacy, aligning instruction to values, emphasizing growth over process, they play a critical role in shaping a student's success. Now, above all, it's essential to remain consistently positive and reassuring throughout the learning process. Encouragement and support are foundational in helping students persist and reach their academic goals. So, as a future educator, I encourage you to strive to cultivate an environment where students are empowered, confident, and celebrated. In that way, you will support not only their academic development, but also their long term confidence and motivation. Thank you all so much for watching this presentation.